Hi, everyone. I'm Raga De Silva. I'm your host of Older Queer Voices podcast. Today, we are focusing on law and love, marriages and divorce, and same sex relationships. Same sex marriage was made legal in the UK in July 2013. The first registered same sex marriage in the UK took place on 29th March 2014. In 2014, there were 4,850 same-sex marriages in England and Wales, and that year also saw 2,411 couples convert their civil partnerships into marriages. The first legal divorce for same-sex marriage in the UK occurred in 2015, and interestingly, 22 divorces were registered in England and Wales that year. Since then, we've had 169,979 same-sex marriages and approximately 7,500 divorces. Marriage equality was a turning point. It gave our relationships the dignity and recognition we had fought for. But what happens when those relationships end? What does love look like when the law is involved? And what does letting go mean for queer people who have built lives, families, and histories together? Today on Older Queer Voices, as I said, we are talking about love, law, and loss with Rachel Cooper, a barrister specializing in family law, and podcaster author Rosie Wilby, host and author of Is Monogamy Dead? And the Breakup Monologues, exploring how we heal and reinvent ourselves through endings. Welcome, Rachel.
Hi, Raga. So nice
Hi.
to be here.
Lovely to see you. Lovely to meet you.
Very lovely to see you and meet you.
And welcome, Rosie.
Hello, good to see you. I mean, we've met before, but it's lovely to see you today.
I have seen your live podcast and I love them. So, and I haven't read your book yet, but I will. But thank you both for being here. And should we start with a little bit of an introduction? Let's start with Rachel, just a little bit about who you are and what marriage and divorce means to you.
So as you said at the introduction, thank you very much. I'm a barrister. I'm a member of a chambers in central London called Quorum Chambers. And I specialise in private children dispute. So that's where there's a dispute between two private individuals about the arrangements for their children after they separate or divorce, and financial remedies. So looking at disputes between parties about their assets and income at the end of a marriage. So that's what I do day to day. And marriage is the most significant contract that you ever enter into. That's what marriage is, certainly in law. And divorce is bringing that contract to an end and ensuring that people's needs and particularly the best interests of children are looked after at the conclusion of those relationships.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm really looking forward to digging deep into this conversation. And Rosie, let us hear about you.
Yes, hello. Well, I worked for many, many years as a stand-up comedian. I still dabble in stand-up comedy because laughter is often a great way through breakups and separations and endings and life's more painful and difficult moments. There is often a humorous side, which maybe we don't see until some time afterwards, but it can perhaps help us process things. So I, for many years, have been writing and thinking and speaking about relationships, romantic love, the psychology of how that works, and how it doesn't work sometimes. And is, our sort of human brains are quite primitive in many ways, and it doesn't necessarily work alongside the rigid structures of the romantic relationships we want to try and fit into. So after I toured a comedy show all about my own breakup, I started a podcast, The Breakup Monologues, and I wrote my two books that you kindly mentioned, Is Monogamy Dead? And The Breakup Monologues, where I really looked and delved into all of this stuff much, much further, really using my own life as a bit of a guinea pig, a bit of a template to look at why I had so many different relationships and breakups myself, and whether this idea of marriage, an ideal of marriage, was really what I wanted.
Interesting. I can't wait to hear all about it, Rosie. Rachel, we'll start with you. Let's start with the landscape. So what does marriage actually mean for queer people, queer couples in the UK today, and how far have we come since marriage equality became law?
Well, I suppose starting with the latter question, I mean, we've come a long way in terms of marriage equality, generally speaking, when you consider that when the first Marriage Act came into effect in 1949, it sort of wasn't even contemplated that there might be anything other than opposite sex marriages. And it really wasn't until the early 70s that laws were put in place that strictly prohibited the marriage of same-sex couples. And so actually sort of find ourselves in the past decade being in a place where same-sex couples enjoy exactly the same rights in law as opposite-sex couples is really an extraordinary thing. So, I mean, really the main thing that has changed over the past decade, so as you said in your introduction, the Marriage Act came into effect in 2013, and then you were able to get married from March of 2014. Prior to that, in 2005, we'd had the Civil Partnerships Act, which created a way in which a same-sex relationship could be recognised in law where previously that had not been possible. And I know we'll come on to talk about that a little bit more later on in the podcast. Over the past decade, the most significant change I think that we've really seen has been the no-fault divorce. So in 2022, the law was changed such that you don't have to ascribe fault at the end of your relationship as to why that's broken down, which was a very significant and old-fashioned thing that required people to sort of sling mud at one another to justify why their marriage had ended. And one of the aspects of that was that you could use adultery as a way to say that, you know, that's why your marriage had come to an end. Now, adultery in law still today is defined as a sexual relationship between someone who is married with someone of the opposite sex. So that wasn't something that anyone within a same-sex couple could use to bring their relationship to an end. It had to be one of the other bases. But since 2022, both for same-sex couples and opposite-sex couples, that's no longer required. It's no longer possible to defend a divorce. If one person has decided that a marriage is at an end, then that is the end, and that's the same for same-sex and opposite-sex couples. And I think aside from that, obviously, there's just, you know, growing acceptance, as you say, you know, year on year. There are increasing numbers of same-sex couples getting married. I think the most recent stats we have are from 2023, and I think it was about 7,200, somewhere in that ballpark, of same-sex marriages. I think almost 5,000 of which were same-sex female couples, which is, I think, the first time that those stats have gone over same-sex male couples. But it's only about 3.5%, I think, of the total marriages within the UK population. And obviously a significant thing as well, which I'm sure we'll come on to talk about, is cohabitees, both for opposite sex and same-sex couples. I think in the last ONS stats that we had, 51% of children are now born to unmarried parents, and we still don't have any laws that protect cohabitants in this jurisdiction, which from my perspective is one of the most extraordinary and most damning things about our legal system, and one of the things that really most of all needs to be looked at, but there doesn't seem to be any appetite for doing so, which I find very difficult to understand.
Wow, and this great statistics. And I'm just looking at it and thinking, wow, we've come a long way, haven't we? But you know, children not having protection basically by law. Do you see that changing in the next a decade, or it will take us longer than that?
So it's slightly complex in that children do have protection. So if the children who are born to unmarried parents, where there are children, the primary carer parent can make applications in law for provision from the other parent. The issue is that that provision only exists for as long as that child is in their minority and thereafter disappears. So, for example, if you were, what was traditionally called a sort of homemaker parent, and you continue to be that, while you might be able to get some support from your child's other parent while they are until they're 18, thereafter that disappears, and that can leave people in positions of real need and unable to meet their housing and or income needs. And that is the major problem. It's about the sacrifices that people make for relationships, that then they find themselves in positions where they can't then look after themselves, which is horrific.
It sounds terrible. I mean, I didn't know about it, and I'm sure a lot of our audience will not have even known about this as well. Rosie, we'll come to you. You've spent years exploring queer relationships and breakups. How do you think the legal recognition has changed the emotional meaning of marriage for a community?
Well, it's really interesting because for many years I've been a queer activist, and I have always fought for and campaigned for equality, and having the same rights as everyone else is a fundamental thing that is good as right? Okay. But within that, I think there's a certain amount of me now thinking, be careful what you wish for. Because when I was a naive young student back in the 1990s, staging a mock wedding demo outside York Minster, where 2 women got married and 2 men got married, fake married, and we sort of dressed up and we wore, we got one of our friends to dress up as a bishop who married the couples, and we had our placards saying "Love is love," and we were shouting through megaphones in the snow and shivering slightly, partly because it was cold, but partly because we thought we were suggesting this outrageous thing that would never happen within our lifetimes. However, now, having studied the psychology of love and having looked at the patterns of behavior of particularly my lesbian friends and my gay male friends, and how sort of the experience of being a woman in a patriarchal world and being a man in the world maybe colors how we behave in our relationships, I am wondering really if the law and romantic love are really somewhat uneasy bedfellows. Freud described love as a temporary psychosis, and I really wonder if someone who induces this temporary psychosis is the right person to be entering this kind of contract that Rachel is talking about. And I wonder if something as ephemeral and fleeting and hard to capture and describe, I'm a writer, I try and describe it, it's really difficult. Something like love, how can we make it contractual, make it transactional? Does it sort of change the quality of love and what it is? I think if you were really going to marry someone and make that pragmatic connection, maybe you should marry your platonic best friend. I mean, I'm just talking from the perspective of someone who's had a lot of breakups and relationships and dramatic relationships. Raga, you have an incredibly mature relationship with Nicola. You're probably just more grown up than I am, because I'm just a silly comedian. So I clearly am still working out all my stuff and my baggage. But, I do think it is complex. And I really looked at how all my lesbian friends seem to have a pattern of rotating partner every few years and much more rapidly rotating through serial monogamy. And I wondered if there's something inherent in being a woman that makes us more sort of impatient to move through different relationships at different stages of our lives. I mean, if you look at heterosexual divorce statistics, around 75% of divorces are initiated by the woman. And then we see in queer couples, lesbians divorcing at many, many times the rate of gay men, who often stay together in a primary partnership for a long, long time, perhaps having some kind of sexual openness or some kind of arrangement that sort of makes them feel a bit more free in the relationship and embracing the kind of freedom that perhaps the GLF were campaigning for back in the 70s, when we were sort of trying to overthrow the patriarchy rather than sort of get into bed with them, which I feel by embracing the sort of old school models of marriage and relationships and embracing old school models of weddings themselves, lesbian brides being given away by their fathers, we're really embracing something I'm not sure as a queer activist and feminist I'm totally comfortable with. All that said, 3 years ago, my wife and I got married because I love her and I knew it was important to her. It was something that she wanted to do. However, I also say, slightly with my tongue in cheek, that 3 years later, we've only just recovered.
Okay. No, I hear you. I hear you. I've heard this many, many times. And, like I said, I respect your views. And Nicola and I fought for marriage equality. Rachel, just so you know, we fought for marriage equality in India. So we are legally married here in the UK. But as soon as we get on a flight or we cross the immigration borders, our marriage is not recognized. And therefore, it has its own challenges that we face. And we can't build assets there. We can't do anything there if we were to be a couple in India. So it is really difficult. And during those very intense conversations I've had, debates I've had on television in India, a lot of activists came up and said, do we need to break this structure called marriage? This doesn't help anyone. Maybe we need to rethink about how that structure would look like, especially for people like us, people from our community. And it has got me thinking, but I'm already married now. I do not want to be one of those statistics in that 7,850, and I don't intend to. But yeah, I mean, marriage does require a lot of adjustment and a lot of maturity. But I'm not saying that people who divorce are not mature. I have been divorced before. So I'm still the same person, whether I was married to the first person or the second person. But we just evolve, I think. Rachel, I want to come back. You made a comment about civil partnerships that in 2005 it was made legal. What is the difference? Why did we need? What is civil partnership, and what are the rights we had in those relationships? And why did we need marriage? And what is the difference?
Well, just before I answer that, and I will, I think it's also interesting to remember that in terms of the community aspect, there was a couple in 2006 who went to Canada and got legally married. And then they came back to the UK and then they tried to get divorced here, and the High Court said, well, no, your marriage isn't recognised here. So I think, those types of steps along any journey towards marriage equality, seem to be very important. So you and Nicola, going back and the slow recognition that this is something that can and does exist. It's not a sort of alien thing. It's just maybe a bit alien within that particular jurisdiction. And in terms of your question, I mean, interesting, I think it goes back to what Rosie was saying about, those days of staging these fake marriages with a fake bishop outside of the town hall. And, really the starting point with civil partnerships was the church. And that was the big issue, was that marriage was this, institution that came, certainly in our jurisdiction, predominantly from a Christian perspective, which was that marriage is something that exists between one man and one woman. And so it was just not possible in 2005 politically to get people around to the idea of same-sex marriage. And so civil partnership became a sort of step along that road. It allowed same-sex couples to get legal recognition, which obviously for all types of things, property, buying assets, for inheritance, for all kinds of reasons is incredibly important, because our jurisdiction is very, very focused on marriage and civil partnerships, and on sort of the way and structuring financial decisions around those relationships. And so that was really important. What was really interesting, I think, because civil partnerships didn't offer anything different. You had the same rights as a civil partner. You still do have the same rights as a civil partner as you do as a married spouse. It's the same. But after marriage equality in 2013, there was a really significant campaign by two academics who sought for the ability of opposite sex couples to also enter into civil partnerships, because there was this sort of moment where the queer community actually had more rights than the opposite sex community, because the queer community could choose to enter into civil partnerships or get married, and the opposite sex community could only get married if they wanted their relationships to be recognised. And so in 2019, the law opened up civil partnerships to allow for opposite sex couples to enter into civil partnerships as well. And really the thinking behind that really goes back to what Rosie was saying. It was all about marriage being this patriarchal concept, which for this particular opposite sex couple felt very overpowering in terms of their relationship, because these ideas of husband and wife were so laden with historical ideas of ownership, of hierarchy, that they simply couldn't get behind. And they felt that for them, as equals, civil partner and civil partner, so both having the same title, felt incredibly important. And so, you know, I think that's why we still have civil partners. I think if potentially, if civil partnership hadn't become a thing for both communities, for all communities, I wonder slightly if that might have just come off the statute book eventually. But I think it probably is here to stay. And I think there is some interesting questions to be asked about the role of patriarchal ideas within marriage and civil partnership. I agree with Rosie about that.
So is there any difference at all legally between civil partnership and there's no? So so do they have to go through the same route as, you know, a same-sex couple who's married legally to file for divorce, for instance? Is that the same process? Is it?
Yes. So it's just a different word. So you divorce at the end of a marriage and you dissolve a civil partnership. So there's a dissolution or a divorce. So there's a difference in the nomenclature, but there's no difference in terms of process or, application of law. It's the same in that respect.
So you couldn't have a dissolution in a marriage?
No, the marriage has to be, you have to get divorced from a marriage.
Wow, interesting. The reason I'm intrigued is because I was in New Zealand 20 years ago when my first marriage was dissolved. It was a legal marriage, and I had a dissolution agreement. So I was wondering, was I cheated twice in my life? No. No, interesting to know, actually, but I'm now officially divorced as well, so that's fine. So great. I mean, Rosie, you know what you just said about marriage and the patriarchy in the heteronormative world that we live in, it's really interesting. So I know you touched upon it a little bit. Can you just kind of expand on that, saying, you know, do queer people relate differently to the idea of marriage? Because it's not just you. I've heard this so many times. And just to put context to this, Nicola and I got married 3 years ago, as you know, probably. And I cannot tell you the number of people who congratulated us, but the number of people, the same people also said, are you sure you want to do this? Yeah, are you sure? It's not because they didn't think that Nicola and I were compatible or that we wouldn't be together. They questioned the idea of getting into a heteronormative, traditional, structure.
Yes.
So, and are we going to reshape this, you think, the future generations?
Well, we could have a go, couldn't we? However, when I spoke about this a few years ago, when we had the first marriages, I did sort of think personally I would prefer to see marriage sort of go in the bin and everybody have civil partnerships. Let's have something new. If we want to legally recognize these relationships, why don't we just do away with all the patriarchal and sort of religious associations? Although I do struggle generally with the idea creating a sense of hierarchy, because you're right to say that everyone congratulates you when you get married, as if that's an amazing achievement, when really it is just signing a piece of paper, in my opinion. I know a lot of people attach a lot of meaning to it, but I attach a lot of meaning to meeting my wife and falling in love with my wife and having a dog and having a cat and making those commitments and having our home. Those things are far more important to me than the piece of paper we signed one day in front of a few relatives. I'm glad that we did that. We did that while my father was still alive, and he really loved it. So that actually is quite important. I think it's important for the people around you sometimes as much as it is for you. But I found it so odd, because I've done so many things in my life that I'm incredibly proud of, like publishing both of my books, touring around the world, winning awards, starting my podcast like you have. It takes a lot of work to do a podcast. And I just thought, oh my God, when my book won an award or my podcast got nominated for an award, I wish all those hundreds of people had rushed to say, oh my God, well done, Rosie. Because they don't know how much those things meant. And in some ways, they meant just as much as marrying my wife. Perhaps they don't mean as much as the ongoing relationship I have with my wife and the foundational love and support and friendship and companionship that we have. But probably those things meant more than that one day where we celebrated our relationship. And the other thing that I do think about the queer community that is really, really important to stress is that when we have separated from relationships, historically, that hasn't always been the end of the world, because queer women in particular are the absolute pioneers, the absolute champions of conscious uncoupling. Never mind Gwyneth Paltrow. We were doing it long before her. And queer women, because we're often socializing in small interconnected networks, everybody knows each other, you've kind of just got to sort out your stuff together, sort out that painful baggage, and really go through that difficult psychological process of remaining friends and being able to be in the same room, being able to be in the same group of friends, of women. So I do think that breaking up, separating hasn't always been this sort of end of all worlds. It is heartbreaking. It is very sad, particularly where adultery or new partners are involved. But it can sometimes mean a new chapter. That's why I sort of did this thing of writing the first half of my book, The Breakup Monologues, backwards, and in a backwards timeline, not literally actually writing backwards. That would be weird. But and then starting in a forwards timeline for the second half, to get that sense that the end of something is also the beginning of something. And one of my most precious relationships of all is the friendship that I have with my first serious girlfriend, Donna. And whenever we see each other, maybe once or twice a year, it's just like old times. We just know each other so well because we've been through so much together. The death of my mum, we had our home burned down and lose a load of our stuff. And we had to get through that together when we were just young adults in our 20s. And we did. And I think those friendships are so important to hold on to. And there's actually, in my novel that I'm writing now, there's a sort of a really amazing kind of, the hero of the novel really is based on my ex. So I think in some ways, my ex is my hero. She's one of the people I feel the most comfortable and safe around. And I think that is something that queer people have done heroically well, is to stay friends with ex-partners.
I agree with you here. And when we socialize and we go out and meet people, you'll hear this often in the lesbian community. This is my ex, and this is also my ex, and now they are together. And they have been together with my other exes. It's so complicated. I mean, I'm glad I'm just with one partner. So I know you talk about monogamy in a different way, but we will talk about it at some point. And interestingly, I just was thinking that civil partnership, and I'm just, Rosie, I'm staying on with you for this. Civil partnership and marriage is basically, there's no difference, as Rachel said. So it's just a terminology. So why would you not want to be married, but say, I'm okay with being in a civil partnership? Is still the same. It's just a terminology that is used differently. So would you just be in a civil partnership and not a marriage?
I mean, it is a semantic difference, isn't it? I think it also creates a sort of hierarchy, whether you have whatever you call a legally sanctioned relationship, whether it is marriage or civil partnership, and one of those has slightly less patriarchal associations historically, it still creates this sense that that relationship is elevated above the cohabiting couple who aren't, or even the couple that are not living together at all. Queer people actually pioneered living apart together because many I was in a relationship for years where we couldn't move in together because she wasn't out to her family. And so we would have had to lie, and I would have had to say I was the flatmate or the friend in the spare room. And that just felt really weird. So we ended up never moving in together. But of course, people always say there's this thing, a model called the relationship escalator, where you are, in order to validate your relationship, supposed to progress through this series of stages that society is sort of rushing you through, from dating to moving in together to getting married to having children. And then, at the end, at the height of the escalator, you die. Hooray! And that's sort of the romantic ending, isn't it? And maybe separating, I suppose what I'm saying is separating amicably and remaining friends could be just as romantic an ending. It's just we haven't socially and culturally recognized it as such, because we have films like The War of the Roses, where we see warring couples who hate each other. Obviously, yes, with no-fault divorce, it has started to change a bit, but we're still very attached to this idea that we must hate our exes and we must block them on Facebook and never speak to them.
Have we lost Rosie? We seem to have lost Rosie. Rachel, I'll come to you in the meantime. I just wanted to share, I know we're talking about Nicola and giving her as a reference. I hope Nicola doesn't mind. But Nicola had a brain injury, say, 5 years ago. And we are an older queer couple. Rosie, welcome back.
I don't know what happened.
It's just the magic of talking about.
And I was just in flow.
She's having technical issues, I think. She'll be back. So like I said, 5 years ago, Rosie, I'll just continue. I was just saying that Nicola had a brain injury 5 years ago, and we are an older queer couple. And that's why she's not very well half the time. And I remember thinking at that point, was like, for example, when she was wheeled into the emergency, they asked her whether they should call her husband or her boyfriend. And in that moment, she had to decide whether she was going to come out, because she was not known, because we've heard of these horrible stories of abuse, homophobia in the healthcare system. So she wasn't sure, but she said, it's my partner and I have a female partner. So that was kind of sorted. The doctors and consultants apologized to her. But we realized, and every time I called for her, whenever I would call the ward, they would put me on and they would say, I was asked for Nicola. And then 5 minutes later, someone would come back and say, I'm sorry, there is no Nicholas in the ward here. You may have got the wrong number. So assuming that I was, of course, calling for a male. Now, these things got us thinking. And because we used to travel quite a bit, I used to worry that if we travel, something happened to either one of us, we couldn't make a decision on behalf of each other. And that's one of the reasons. Of course, love is taken for granted, that there is lots of love in our relationship, but we needed to legalize it to have legal rights in case of such emergencies, in case of assets that we had built together. So Rachel, coming back to you on that, do you think, and my question is a little awkward, do you think older queer people in particular, choose the route of marriage or civil partnership for these reasons?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think I totally understand what Rosie says in terms of, the marriage just being, a piece of paper. But I think the reality is that, marriage does have this enormous significance within our society. And, I think one of the reasons why I think queer people choose to get married rather than going down the civil partnership route is because you've kind of attained that highest recognition of your relationship that is possible. Obviously, you can't get that religious recognition, but you can get the civil recognition of that marriage. And what that does do, it does give you all of those rights, as I said, or the inheritance rights, the rights to get property. So if one of you dies, all of the property comes over immediately without having to pay an inheritance tax at that point in time, which means that you have the security of housing if you fall into a bracket of assets that would mean that you would pay inheritance tax eventually. And obviously, as you say, the rights at hospitals or in any other place to say, this is my spouse, this is my legally recognized partner that you need to allow into this emergency room. You need to allow them to sign documents on my behalf. You need to allow them to make decisions potentially on my behalf if I am not capable of doing so. And also for your children, if you have any children, for there to be another person with parental responsibility if something happens to you, that they can take care of that. Now, you don't have to be married in order to have parental responsibility. Those two aren't linked. But it gives you that recognizable format to your relationship, which I think, in a utopia, in an ideal, and an Angela Carter type world, maybe we wouldn't need that. But I think in this world that we live in, I think the queer community still do, in order to protect themselves, their assets, and their relationships. And I think it is a really interesting one, the point that Rosie made about, the different ways in which those relationships can exist. So the way that we approach marriage within this jurisdiction is that the start date of the marriage is the start of your continuous cohabitation. So it's not the date on which you got married, it's the date on which you began continuously cohabiting. And so if, for example, you had been continuously cohabiting for 20 years before 2014, and then you got married in 2014 and you got divorced in 2015, your marriage would be treated as having been 21 years long, because it would start from that. But obviously, that wouldn't apply. And there are cases where you have these huge, courts have to make factual determinations about whether or not people have cohabited, because that period, if assets have been purchased in one person's name or the other during that period, they might be considered to be matrimonial. But if, say, you've been living apart, either because someone isn't out or for whatever reason, then your marriage wouldn't count that period of time. Even if, say, you'd been pooling resources to some degree, you would end up spending lots of money arguing about the length of your relationship, essentially. And that could be problematic. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but those are some things to think about.
Well, it's very interesting because there's so many layers to this. It's very complex. I've got a young friend of mine who's been married for a year and a half, was with her partner for another year and a half. So that's 3 years together. Now they filed for divorce. It's not worked out for them. And now there's this whole, as you can imagine, whole very, very challenging, difficult conversations happening between them. And one of the things that my friend's lawyer has suggested is that tell her that she needs to, be transparent about her financials for the last 3 years. And if you own anything, if she has her own savings and it gets divided, including what's in the trust. And that brought me thinking that how does it work in our community? I mean, where we have long-term relationships and we may have a separate trust that we have created either together or individually. So it gets very complex, right, Rachel, as we go along? And yeah.
No, it does. And it's sort of, I think one of the things is that I wonder if when you haven't been able to do something for such a long time, because there just was no ability to get married or no ability to have your relationship recognized, you can be so desperate to attain that thing, I just want my relationship to be recognized in this way that wasn't possible, that you can just sort of run into it without necessarily thinking about, the practicalities of it or all these other things. And I think that can be one issue that can impact on a community where there has been those barriers to entry for so long. Because the reality is that, if you have pre-acquired assets, if you have trusts that haven't been formed during the matrimonial relationship, all of those things can be protected. You can have cohabitation agreements, you can have prenuptial agreements. They're not binding in law, but they are very persuasive. And as long as the nuptial agreement provides for the needs of both parties and potentially any children at the end of that marriage, if there are things that the source of the assets, I don't know, something that you've inherited from someone or a property that you purchased that hasn't ever been intermingled within the relationship, it's possible to keep those things separate. But you have to sort of have a think about it and put structures into place. And I think sometimes it's that stopping to think, this is a contract that I'm entering into. It's not just signing on the dotted line because I love someone today and I might not love them tomorrow. It's really like a big deal. And so giving it some thought is also, I think, a very loving act. And I think, a lot of the time, but in both opposite sex couples and same sex couples, there can be this idea, and I think maybe it's also very English, this sort of embarrassment to talk about money, or that it's not romantic to talk about money, or somehow you're undermining your relationship by talking about money. I mean, to my mind, talking about money is really, the most loving thing that you can do, because that's how we survive. And so and if you can't have an open and honest conversation with someone about money, then I really question whether you should be marrying them at all. So I think, irrespective of whether you have a nuptial agreement or any kind of agreement at all about assets, having those conversations, what looks fair to me? Does our ideas of fairness align? Like, if we were to get divorced, would we have similar ideas about what each of us should have? And if we don't, then maybe we need to question whether our sort of fundamental perspectives are aligned or not. So I think those kind of things aren't thought about enough. But I think that goes to both queer communities and heterosexual communities. It's not just the queer community. I just think there's that striving to get there that maybe pushes those questions out of the queer community.
Sure. Rachel, that's the most beautiful thing I've heard, that actually talking about money matters, right? It's the most loving thing you said. And I so agree with you, because these are difficult conversations to have. But if you can't have difficult conversations, even before you have decided to be together for the rest of your life, what's the point? Because that's when when what Rosie was alluding to, that it's, a lot of couples just, part, but they amicably part. But I also know of couples who hate each other, and they hate each other because they haven't had, this conversation in the first place. So how important it is. Rachel, one of the things that I'm very keen to know, because that's also come from my thinking around this young couple who's going through a divorce, is a pet. They share a pet. Are there any laws protecting the pets? Because they're like our children, right? Our pets.
So it's a great and very contemporaneous question, Raga. So there's a lot of effort being made at the moment to try and change the approach to pets. I kind of find it extraordinary in England, where we're so obsessed with animals, that this hasn't been sort of looked at before. But at the moment, in terms of legally, pets are just treated as chattels. So as they're just owned, they're another sort of asset that people own, and you just have to decide, what you do with it. And frankly, judges don't, not because they don't care personally, but there isn't a lot that they can really do. So people sort of just have to kind of fight that out themselves. But I think, there is some efforts being made to try and see if there can be a sort of a position that you could put pets into where they can be looked at slightly differently. And I think that has its challenges, because obviously, sharing agreements with animals like, dogs is much more easy than with animals like cats, who, need to stay in their own place. And, so it's, I think, complex and challenging, but I think, something needs to be done about it.
Yeah, there
Go on, Rosie.
there is some stuff on my podcast and in my book all about pets, because pets are so important to the queer community. I mean, they are, for many of us, our children, our babies, and they take on that extra layer of significance. So I think it is something super important for our community in particular.
Yeah. I know someone who has a snake, a large snake, a python, I think, as a pet. Like, I'm like, okay.
They can keep that.
Truly. That's so true. But this is such an interesting conversation we are having today, because I don't know if people really sit back and actually think about these things. I've done a podcast on this earlier in my second episode on law, actually, on something similar, but it wasn't about family. It was about just how do we protect ourselves. And in my live event that I had for the Older Queer Voices podcast, when we launched it, one of the questions we asked people is, do you have paperwork in place? Do you have your will signed? Do you have your power of attorneys? I tell you, in a room of 80, there was nobody who had done that. They had not even thought about it. So this is why we thought it was critical for us to have these conversations, because these are very important matters. As I say, difficult conversations to have, but important conversations to have, because now that I am in the age that I am, I've seen a lot of people. We hang out with older people. The oldest person where I live is 90 years old. No paperwork in place. So tomorrow, if something happens to him as a single man, I don't even know. I think the king is going to be very happy getting his property. But, these are conversations that we forget about. And is there?
But Raga, I do think that the law by its nature is somewhat reductive. And the point of my first book, Is Monogamy Dead?, was really to look at how we have made so many assumptions about something like monogamy being completely universal and it meaning exactly the same thing to every single couple, or indeed throuple, or people in other types of arrangements, but everyone in a relationship. Whereas everybody has...
I think Rosie's having technical issues. I'm sorry for those listening, watching. Rachel, do you want to add to this?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think, Rosie's right in the sense that, one of the areas of law that I've looked at quite a lot over the past couple of years are triads or thruples, whichever way you put it. And obviously there's no way in our jurisdiction for a triad relationship to be recognised. You're always going to have, if two people in that relationship are married, that relationship is always going to be more protected than the third person in that relationship. And there's, I've seen some real creative thinking around this in terms of, triads in the US, for example, forming limited partnerships so that they can own property together or have bank accounts with all three of their names on it. But, you have to kind of go to that out of the box thinking in order to try and look at other types of relationship, which, as Rosie said, sit outside of the monogamous framework, and then you still have issues of inheritance, issues of nationality, all of those types of things that are really, really significant issues that one person in that relationship, or if it's a quad, two people, depending on whether they both get married, there's going to be difficulties for any relationship that sits outside of the traditional monogamous form.
But I suppose my point was that even within monogamous models, we all are different. And my relationship with my wife, Suzanne, will be totally different to Raga's relationship with Nicola. And Rachel, I don't know if you're in a relationship, but your relationship with your partner, if you are in one currently or were in one in the past, all those relationships will look different, will feel different. We'll have different discussions about our unique boundaries and how we define ourselves within a romantic or sexual or some kind of partnership that we want to commit to, because of course some people are asexual or aromantic. So how do we define what and who we are in a relationship? There are a lot of assumptions even within monogamy about what that exactly is, and the law sort of assumes that queer people approach marriage in much the same way that men and women always have. When even within heterosexual marriage, I bet there's a lot of people who try and do it differently, but it's very hard to sort of to fight against that social expectation of what marriage is and means.
I agree.
Yeah, I think it is interesting, but I think it's one of the things that I think is most complex about the way that we approach marriage breakdown or civil partnership breakdown, is that within our jurisdiction we have an entirely a system whereby each relationship is looked at on its own merits, and each judge that has the ability, they have certain criteria they look at, the income, the assets that are available, the earning capacities, children, etc. But then they can look at a bespoke outcome for each couple, and that's why one of the complaints that's made about the way that our jurisdiction approaches divorce is that it's really difficult for you as an outsider to know what the outcome might be as a lay person who's not a lawyer. And I totally accept that criticism. It's really difficult to understand from the outside what is a fair outcome. If I went to a court, what would the judge say is a fair outcome? So that's the negative side. The positive side is that actually it means that each relationship is looked at internally. What are the decisions that have been made in that relationship? What do they mean in terms of the way in which the finances have been structured? What does that mean in terms of the financial outcomes for those people later on down the track? Whereas if you had a system that's much more structured, for example, like the bill that Baroness Deach is trying to bring into effect, it means that there's a kind of one-size-fits-all model, and I think that is potentially much more difficult. I mean, it's much easier to understand from the outside, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it will lead to fairer outcomes from the inside. So it's a complex question, but I think it's one of the things I think makes my job quite interesting, is that you're looking at each relationship and its different qualities and what that then means in terms of outcome at the end of the relationship.
Yeah, and family structures have changed now fully. I mean, when we do panel discussions, there are sometimes families who, again, like I said earlier, they would have had multiple partners. They have children from different relationships, and again, add the pet to it. And then there's this huge, and then some of them are living overseas, they've left the country. It gets so complex. When I talk to people, it's like, I don't even know whether I want to be in a relationship with that kind of complexity. That it gets worse and worse. And but what is interesting, Rosie, I'm going to come to you on this, and it's very your viewpoint is really interesting. And like I said, I know there are a lot of people who would agree with you, and there are a lot of people who will not, and that's okay. But when and you write about breakup, I love that you do, because that is so important. We forget that how breakups are actually really, really important, how you break up, especially if you have a child or a pet or parents that you love. So how do you think that within our community, given the kind of work that you do, do you think that our community understands this when they get into relationships, that breakups are as equally important as much as getting together? Because we get overnight, we are together with the person, right?
Yes, I think in our community, we really do recognize breakups, and almost the breakup can be the time when the relationship does feel legitimized and recognized. Sadly, when I've had relationships where I felt invisible throughout the duration of it, perhaps because my partner wasn't out or because the world didn't recognize us in many ways, it is that breakup. And when your friends are all there for you because something is ended, that it's almost confirmed that it did exist, if you know what I mean. So in a sad way, the breakup is often the thing that really confirms it existed and it was real and it feels very tangible. But I also think that queer people are, in some ways, we've developed more resilience, not for great reasons often, because we have experienced bullying at school or all kinds of vicissitudes. And so we have built up these resilience skills. So I do think that in many ways we are prepared for hard things. We're prepared for breakups. Statistically, as we've discussed, queer women have often been through many more than anyone else. The reasons for that are up for debate. But, you know, I feel like compared to many of my heterosexual female friends who suddenly maybe experienced a divorce in their 40s, it was kind of the first really painful or stressful or difficult thing that had happened to them, and they didn't know what to do. Whereas many queer women sort of were able to get on with it, even though it was painful, because they'd done it before and they had that knowledge, that self-knowledge, that they would be able to get through it.
Yeah, interesting. See, still in your 40s, you're very young, right? And we're talking about older queer voices. I've seen separations happen at 70. They've been together 40 years and they can't now stand each other and they've decided to move on. So, Rachel, for couples navigating separation later in life, where the law may not reflect years of shared life, like we talked about it earlier, before legal status. So, what advice would you give to ensure that fairness and dignity is, available in that process?
I think it's the same advice I'd give to anyone, really. I mean, when you're looking at older people separating, getting divorced, there can often be, these can often be second marriages, second divorces, and so often you have issues of if there's property or things that are being put in trust for children of those previous relationships, for example, like how that looks. When you're looking at older couples, you're often looking at pension rights and what that means in terms of your ability to have an income later on in life. And so it is about thinking through the stage of life that you are in, and particularly when you're getting into a second, third, fourth. I mean, I think I always say, never marry someone you wouldn't want to divorce, and I think it's really important to sort of think through whether this is someone who you could go through a breakup with in a healthy way at the outset of your relationship, because that might be the outcome. And I think there is so much social stigma around divorce, and I think actually one of the things that I think is particular to the queer community is that I think a bit in line with what I was saying earlier about that sort of desire to get on board with this structure that wasn't available previously, is that a lot of the time there can be a lot more shame around separation and divorce, because for some queer people, you're trying to say, I can have this marriage that's equal to a heterosexual marriage, particularly if you've come from a family where there was real difficulties in coming out or being accepted as a queer person. And that can make people stay in very unhappy marriages and relationships for longer. It can also make it much more difficult for people to speak out about abusive relationship or abuse within the relationship or domestic abuse. And that can be covered up in sort of the hope that they can prove to the world that you can have a good relationship as a queer person, that you can have these long marriages. And that's something that's very dangerous, and that's something I do think we need to look out for, is to create space for marriages and relationships to just not work, either because they just don't work or because they're actually abusive and unhealthy. And in those cases, there needs to be that space for it to be possible to say, I need help, and that there isn't that judgment of, oh, you've let the team down because you were this, great shining light of the future of the queer community, and you've sort of let us all down.
Yeah, it's such a thing for, like, I'm from India, as you know, and in India, the first time that I divorced, I was like, my mom said to me, please don't tell anyone, just pretend. For 15-20 years, she would always ask about my ex-husband in front of everyone, because that made her feel that I was still married, and keep on with the show. And I love what you said, never marry someone you can't divorce. It's such a quotable quote. I think I'm going to use this. It's so true. And marriage, I know we're coming to the end, and I said 60 minutes is, gosh, time's just really gone. Marriage is such I don't know other cultures. In our culture, marriage is a social status. It gives you a social status. So you're always the missus to some mister. So it gives you social status. So when that ends, that goes, a lot of women find themselves that they have no status, at least in our culture, which of course I broke the mold and made sure that that was never repeated for me. But we have to come to the end, sadly. And I'm going to ask you both a same question. And if you have anything else to add, please feel free to add, is about community. So community plays a big role in our resilience, and Rosie, you touched upon it. How can we, as a queer community, better support those going through separation or divorce, especially the older queer people who are now invisible and they're forgotten? Rosie, start with you, or
Oh, sure.
the law?
Yeah, I do think it's really important to support one another. And that is, in fact, really why I started up my podcast, because I felt that we didn't talk about breakups enough. And when we did talk about relationships and breakups, it was often a textbook with a sort of dusty heteronormative disclaimer at the beginning, assuming that all relationships work the same as a relationship between a man and a woman. And I think if you are two queer people separating, particularly perhaps two queer women, then you do have a certain set of pressures that are loaded onto you. I think single women in society do have a certain stigma attached to them. It's getting less, but I think everywhere around the world, a sort of woman on her own is sort of commented on, isn't it? As if you're some kind of failure, that you didn't, that you didn't keep a man, or, even if they know that you're queer, well, you didn't keep your woman either, So I do think we have to really create that sense of community, and that's really what I did, and why I've particularly loved recording a lot of the live episodes in front of an audience, because I get people to kind of put their hands up and who's been dumped, cheer if you've been dumped, and everyone sort of just lets out that angst together, because there is a humor to it after some time has passed, and we've all been there. You're not alone. It's part of being human, sadly, to be heartbroken. And my sort of good takeaway from it is that we often become wiser, bigger, better, more incredible, powerful, strong people after a breakup. It will teach you so much about yourself, because sadly you're forced to reflect on who you are, what you need, what you want, but you may be equipped to make better choices in the future.
Thank you, Rosie. Rachel, you, any thoughts?
I mean, I think for me, it's all about education, really, from a legal perspective. I think educating people about domestic abuse, that domestic abuse very much exists within same-sex relationships as well as in opposite-sex relationships, that women can be as abusive as men. I've certainly seen it in my cases. And for us to really, as a community, be much more open-minded about that, much more supportive, much less, it will pass, it's probably nothing, so that, but also an education in terms of there is no such thing as a common law marriage. If you've lived together for 30, 40, 50 years, that doesn't mean that the state is going to recognise your relationship in the way that it would if you were married. And to really, I think what I said earlier, to take some advice. This is a contract that you're entering into. It is the most significant for a lot of people, financial legal contract that you will ever enter into. So think about it, get some advice, particularly if you're getting married later and you've got assets that you're coming into the relationship with that you might want to protect at the end of it. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing unromantic about that. It's just about how you want to set up your relationship, and you can change your mind. If you think you want to protect certain assets at the beginning of your relationship and then things change and you want to bring those in because everything's going well, you can change your mind. That there is an evolution that is possible legally. So I would want people to really just think more about what they're entering into and make sure that they understand what they are giving away as well as what they are receiving when they enter into those marriages or civil partnerships.
It's a fantastic end to our conversation. And a friend of mine said to me, marriage is about love, and so is divorce. And and I thought to myself, actually, it is true because, if you can't divorce, and again, I'm going to repeat that line you said, never marry someone you can't divorce. And it's going to sit with me for a long time. So I think I made the right decision, at least in my case. And lovely, lovely, lovely to have you both. I think this is one conversation we could just have extended, and maybe we will have a part two for this, because I think Rachel and Rosie, there are lots of questions that I still have about family structures, about international laws, about protection as well. I think we need to talk about it. What happens when a couple, are together but are in long distance relationships, for instance? We haven't tackled those kind of things, and children are sometimes split between two parents and they are different countries, and all these cases I am aware of because I get signposted quite a bit. And then what happens in relationships that are interracial, for instance, so those kind of things, I think I'd bring you back to a part two, but for now we have to have a happy ending. It's a story, as I said, as old as time, but for queer people, it's also a story of courage, of claiming our space in the world that once denied us recognition, whether through marriage, civil partnership, or choosing ourselves after heartbreak. Every ending holds the potential for renewal. So I'm going to thank you both. Rachel Cooper, thank you very much. And any contact details, anybody, anywhere you want anyone to reach out to you, if you have written a book as well or papers you want to share, please send them to us. Rosie, we know where you are, and I look forward to meeting you again in person and sharing more. The Older Queer Voices podcast is something that has been shared around quite a bit now, and I hope this episode also gets promoted well, because we all need these kind of conversations and these voices. I want to thank the one and only Nicola Fenton, who works tirelessly behind the scene, and in spite of her disabilities, I'm a big thank you, Nicola. I want to thank our HR Proud. We welcome your feedback and comments. Please write to us on theviewsroom@gmail.com. And to our listeners, thank you for listening to Older Queer Voices. Please share, please subscribe. Our YouTube channel is The Views Room, or find us on Spotify and Apple Music. Thank you very much. I've had a wonderful, wonderful 1 hour, 6 minutes and 57 seconds. I wish it was more. Thank you very much.